best thing we can do is start by reading it. Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea. Though its waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. God is within her, she will not fall. God will help her at break of day. Nations are in uproar, kingdoms fall. He lifts his voice, the earth melts. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Come and see the works of the Lord, the desolations he has brought on the earth. He makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Okay, let's start by putting up this photograph here. There we go. That's a great photo, isn't it? You may have seen this photo before. It was well known at one time, quite some time ago now. We had a wall-size poster of it. Oh, we got some feedback. We had a wall-size poster of it in our home when we lived in Newfoundland. It's called simply A Lighthouse in a Storm, and it was taken by French photographer Jean Guichard back in 1989. The lighthouse is still standing. It's off the northwest coast of France, near Brittany. Now, it looks like the lighthouse keeper, Theodore Malgorn, is taking a breath of fresh air, but in fact, he's frightened, and he's waiting for rescuers to take himself and his colleagues away from the dangerous waves and a life-threatening situation. Here's what an article online said about it. The keepers have been living in fear of death during the 1989 storm, and at one point had taken refuge in the lantern room of the tower. Waves the night before had smashed through the lower windows of the tower, causing the structure to flood, washing away everything in its path, including the television, table, chairs, coffee maker, and even the refrigerator. The keepers were waiting to be rescued by helicopter. So when he hears the sound of the helicopter, Theodore steps out of the lighthouse to greet what he thinks is the rescue party. Then he realizes it's not who or what he thought. It is, in fact, the photographer Jean Guichard, who had arranged to get a helicopter to take him out so he could take photographs of the dramatic images of the waves smashing against the rocks and against the lighthouse. Now, the lighthouse keeper is initially oblivious of the incoming wave. But fortunately, he saw it just in time to step back inside and slam the door before the wave engulfed him, an action which no doubt saved his life. Whenever I read Psalm 46, I think about this photo and I think about water. About 71% of the Earth's surface is covered by water, and the oceans hold 96.5% of all of Earth's water. And here's another interesting fact, which I think is particularly relevant when you think about the flood of Noah's day and the credibility challenge that poses for some. If the surface of the earth were made smooth by flattening down all the mountains and lifting up all the valleys, kind of like when you take a snowball and you pat it all together and squeeze it down so it's nice and round and smooth, the water that exists in our ocean basins today would cover the surface of the earth to a depth of 2.7 kilometers all the way around the globe. Think about that. Right now, you'd be 2.5 kilometers underwater. I think that water, and the seas in particular, can teach us a lot about life and also about God. And maybe that's one of the reasons why the Bible tells us that when God makes a new heaven and a new earth, there's not going to be any more sea. Maybe because we won't need that tool of instruction anymore. You've heard the expression, life's troubled sea. And certainly life sometimes mimics the storms which can occur at sea. Psalm 46 says, "Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way, and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, and the mountains quake with their surging." This is why I think about water when I think about Psalm 46. Psalm 46 is not predominantly about water, but it is about the storms of life and how we can stand up to them and face them. So I'm going to talk about that and maybe tell a few stories. Now, I'm not going to talk about Psalm 107 because I think someone else is going to do that at a later date, but I do want to mention a few verses there that are relevant to our subject today. Psalm 107 talks about the wondrous works of God, and the psalm is very cyclical in its theme. First, it describes how bad life can be, sometimes through our own sin, and other times not through any doing of our own, no fault of our own, and how miserable and desperate we can become. And then it describes how God can intervene and change things. Then it repeats the theme with other circumstances. In the middle of the psalm, it talks about the sea, and it says this: "Others went out on the sea in ships. They were merchants on the mighty waters. They saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunken men. They were at their wits' end." Well, Hazel and I can identify a little bit with that. We were working with the mission Operation Mobilization in 1988, and we were on their ship, the MV Doulos, and we just left Taiwan en route to Hong Kong. It was only a 3-day voyage, and we were glad about that, because Hazel was 3 months pregnant with Kylie. And if there's one thing we can say about Hazel's pregnancies is that they were consistent. She threw up every day for 9 months. Never missed a day, not one. So being on a ship at sea is not the most ideal location if you're pregnant and nauseous. We hardly cleared the breakwater in Taichung when we hit the storm, and it didn't slack up for 3 days. We have very vivid memories of that voyage. We had 10-meter seas the whole time. I can remember going out on the prom deck, which was the lowest deck that was open to the outside, and looking at a wall of water in front of me, and that's all you could see. You couldn't see the sky because of the deck that came out above. It was just a wall of water right in front of you. And the next second, there was nothing. You had to go and look over the rail and look all the way down to see the sea way down there somewhere. It made me think of the Israelites walking through the Red Sea with a wall of water on their right hand and on their left. Now, Hazel and I had different responses to this kind of voyage. Hazel wasn't sick because of the sea, she was sick because of the pregnancy, but she would get a little bit scared. The Doulos wasn't really big as ships go, and in this kind of sea state, the stern would come right out of the water and the top of the propeller along with it, and then you would feel the shudder go right through the ship just like it was going to break apart. I wasn't scared, but I did get pretty nauseous myself in that kind of sea state. Now, I had just purchased some reconditioned electric motors in Taiwan, and I stored them in the stern of the ship down in the hold. Unfortunately, our welders had been working back there, replacing some steel, and they hadn't finished closing up the deck just above this. And I realized we were taking water in over the stern. So I went back and went down in the hold to check on the motors and found that they were completely submerged in seawater. There was only one thing to be done. I called out the electrical team, we hooked up a chain fall, and we hoisted all the motors up out of the hold, and we disassembled them all, and we washed them out with fresh water before the salt could do any damage. All this in the stern of the ship, where the motion was the greatest. 30 feet up, 30 feet down. It was like working in an elevator, change direction every 30 seconds. And our stomachs right along with it. By the time we'd done with the motors, the sea state was at its highest, and I headed back to our cabin. Things were progressing back there as well. We had what we considered a pretty nice cabin by Doulos standards. We had recently moved into it, and it was bigger than the tiny little cabin we'd had before. It had a small countertop with shelves on it where Hazel had jars with sugar and flour, etc., and she'd do some baking. Drawers beneath it. And opposite this, there was a small table with some bench seating. It was great for having people in for coffee and for playing Dutch Blitz, if I remember right. Hazel was lying back horizontal on the bed, understandably, and I just lay back on one of the benches. I was white. And then the ship took a big roll over to the port side, which was our side. And then it took an even bigger roll over to the starboard side, which is the side that had all the shelves and the drawers on it. Don't get ahead of me. And then suddenly I had a revelation. For the first time in my Christian life, I foresaw the future. But I was too sick to do anything about it. Or maybe I didn't care. I may have said to Hazel, "Get ready." And then we took the biggest roll of all over to the port side. And every single thing that was on those shelves shot off. And everything that was in those drawers came out. And it all went flying down onto the floor. And there was flour and sugar, everything, everywhere, cutlery, you name it. I walked through it for 3 days. Didn't even try to clean it up. There were white footprints going out of our cabin and up the corridor. Now, why tell you all that? Well, I tell you all that just so that you know that God doesn't always calm the storm. He can do it. Jesus did do it. And I can tell you there were a lot of people on board the Doulos that voyage who were praying he'd do it again, but he didn't. Sometimes God just gives the grace and the strength and the help to ride it out. Ride it out. And this is where Psalm 46 comes in. Look at the first verse. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Now, maybe you're facing trouble today. Maybe it seems like your ship is going to sink or break up. Maybe you're scared, or maybe you're just sick of it. But you're not alone in your ship. And though it's hard, there are even worse things. I developed a philosophy during those years. I decided I'd rather be seasick with Jesus than have smooth sailing with the devil. And you can have smooth sailing with the devil for a season. You can. Besides, we need to remember that the New Testament tells us that we must enter the kingdom of God through many hardships. Do you ever think about, what about if you have a fairly easy Christian life and you get to heaven, you meet all those people who have suffered? You ever think about that? I remember a poster that was on one of the doors on the Doulos. It was a picture of a quiet harbor, and the caption under it said, "A ship in a harbor is safe, but that's not what ships are for." On the other hand, sometimes God does intervene in the storms of life. Psalm 46 verse 5 says, God is within her, she will not fall. God will help her at break of day. God is not restricted in what he can do. Don't ever doubt that he's able to change your circumstances if that's the best thing for you or for others or for his greater plan. I remember another voyage on the Doulos. I don't recall where we were headed, but it was the time for tropical storms, and a typhoon, a typhoon developed, and it was headed right for us. Our captain at the time was a man by the name of Pertti Merisalo from Finland. He was a very gentle man, very soft-spoken and humble. In fact, not a very typical captain. But he was a man of great faith. The radio officer was a young man from Ireland named Mike Mullins. He was on the bridge that night with the captain as they bent over the map and they tracked the typhoon that was bearing down on us. And then Mike got the shock of his life. The captain bent down over the map to the spot where the typhoon was, and he started blowing on it. And he said, "In the name of Jesus, in the name of Jesus." Mike didn't know what to think. Thought the captain was cracking up. So he didn't say anything. Just went back to his station and kept monitoring the radio. And then the next weather report came in. Typhoon had changed direction and was heading directly away from us. Right? Don't ever think that God is not able, or worse, that he doesn't care. If he doesn't change things, then there's a reason, even though we can't see the reason for it, but he can certainly change them if he chooses to. And then there are other times when God allows trouble to come, but with limitations attached. Job 38 says, "Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness, when I fixed limit for it and set its doors and bars in place, when I said, 'This far you may come and no farther. Here is where your proud waves halt.'" Again, we have this picture of the sea with all of its power, and yet still within limits that God had set. In 2010, Newfoundland experienced Hurricane Igor, and a great deal of damage was done. We had the opportunity of experiencing it firsthand. The house we have on Random Island was right in the path of the storm. A small brook that flowed next to the house rose from a few inches to about 10 or 12 feet. When my cousin checked on the house after the storm, he found that water had come into the lower level, up to the level of the doorknobs. It was incredible how much damage 3 feet of water could do just by rising and falling. It was like a river had flowed through it. Everything was destroyed on the lower level. Now, the house had belonged to my father, and it was painful to see almost all of his earthly possessions destroyed. But then I saw something else. In the study, all of the bookcases, which were pressboard, had swelled up with the water, of course, and had all fallen apart, and the shelves had collapsed, and the books had gone into the water. But there were several upper shelves which had Dad's writings from over the years and some Bibles. And the shelf had collapsed on one side, and the binders and Bibles had slid over, but they didn't go into the water, and the water stopped rising just below the level of that shelf. This far you may come, and no farther. So you may have pain and suffering in your life, but it's not without limits, and God determines what those limits are. And if God sets a boundary, no one can cross it. The storms of life can also form part of God's greater plan. Romans 8:28, where it talks about all things working together for good, is not a cliche. It's a solid theological truth. God will use the storms to shape our characters, as well as to plot the direction he wants our lives to take. In the first year and a half after I became a Christian, 3 major events occurred for me. First was that a relationship I had been in for 5 years ended. Second was that my job of 7 years ended. And the third was that my mother, who had prayed for me for 24 years before I became a Christian, died of cancer at the relatively young age of 52. And the devil said to me, "Give it up. Give it up. You never had it this bad when you were with me." It was true. It was true. But by the grace of God, I didn't give it up. I said, "No, I'm not going back." And within the next year and a half, 3 other things happened as a direct result of those 3 things. 3 best things that ever happened to me. 1, I met Hazel. 2, I ended up in a solid Bible teaching church that discipled me. And 3, we were introduced to world missions. And those 3 things changed the course of our lives entirely. And none of them would have happened if it were not for the first 3 things, right? And then there are times when God uses the storms of life just to reveal his glory and power. Psalm 46 in verse 8 and 9 says, "Come and see the works of the Lord, the desolations he has brought on the earth. He makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire." Sometimes it seems that God wants to prove a point beyond any shadow of a doubt. I'm thinking of Elijah on Mount Carmel. Prophets of Baal had spent the whole day calling on their God to send fire and burn up their sacrifice. No response. And then Elijah does this for his sacrifice. 1 Kings 18. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood." "Do it again," he said, and they did it again. "Do it a 3rd time," he ordered, and they did it the 3rd time. The water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. Water again. It wasn't enough for God to send down fire to light off the sacrifice. That was too easy. No, he was going to make sure that there was no earthly way for that stuff to burn. And so he drowned it until it was saturated through and through. And then in verse 38, it says, "Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench." It's almost as if there are times when God says, "Now just watch this." I remember when my father was taken in hospital and required bypass surgery. We were still on the doulos, getting close to the start of the electrical refit project that we have been working towards for 3 years. And I flew home from Japan for Dad's operation. During the operation, he had a stroke. One side was paralyzed, and he was in a coma. Now, this was an impossible situation. I couldn't leave him, and I couldn't go. I couldn't stay, because I had to get back to the ship. We were about to start this refit project. Doctor said it was possible he might not come out of the coma, or he might come out and need long-term care. He just couldn't predict what was going to happen. Dad was in his mid-70s then. People in our home church were praying. People back on the ship were praying. People at the OM ship's headquarters in Germany were praying. Dad was in the coma for 3 days. On the third day, I walked into the intensive care unit to find him awake, sitting up in bed. And when he saw me, he held up his hand on the side that had been paralyzed. And the next day, he was up walking around. I think that there are times when God says, "It's just not hard enough for me yet. It's not hard enough for me yet." See, if Dad had had that relatively routine surgery and had come through it okay, we would have praised God and thanked God for it, sure. But not nearly as much praise as when he almost had to raise him from the dead, right? So in the midst of our pain and our struggles and our troubles, we need to remember that God's glory is still more important than them all. And if the only thing that happens is that our problems get fixed for us, then that's not good enough, right? That's not good enough. That falls far short of what we're here to do. I said at the beginning that Psalm 46 is about the storms of life, and how we can face them. So let's come back to our lighthouse photograph again. Maybe you can put that photograph back up again. There you go. Psalm 46, verse 7 says this, and verse 11 repeats it. "The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress." So as we're reminded in this photograph, a lighthouse has to be built like a fortress in order to withstand the storms. Proverbs 18:10 says, "The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous run to it and are safe." The lighthouse keeper ran into the tower and he was safe. When we run to God, we are safe. Storms are inevitable in life. It's not a matter of if, it's a case of when. But just like the old hymn says, we have an anchor that keeps the soul steadfast and sure while the billows roll. We still have that poster that I had of that lighthouse. But instead of at home, I put it up in the rebuilt study downstairs in the house at Random Island, and I hung it just above the water line.